The first sound he heard every morning was the radiator knocking like it was angry at being alive. The room was small, rented, and never fully warm. He slept on a mattress on the floor, not because he liked it simple, but because furniture cost money he didn't have. When he stood up, his feet touched cold concrete, and for a moment he just stayed there, breathing, preparing himself for another day that already felt heavy. Outside, people hurried to places that expected them. He pulled on the same jacket he'd worn for years and wondered when life would stop feeling like something he was trespassing in. The city looked different at that hour. Honest. No promises. Just streets, lights, and people trying to survive in their own quiet ways. He walked past buildings he'd never been inside, imagining what it would feel like to belong somewhere. To not feel temporary. To not feel like one bad week away from losing everything he already barely held together. He didn't know it then, but this was the last phase of his life where everything felt empty before it started filling up in unexpected ways. He came from nothing that could be measured. No savings. No safety net. No family money quietly waiting to catch him if he fell. His parents worked hard, but hard work had never seemed to love them back. Growing up meant learning how to stretch meals, how to nod politely when classmates talked about vacations, how to pretend you weren't embarrassed when the electricity went out again. As an adult, he bounced between jobs that promised stability and delivered exhaustion. Warehouses, late shifts, early mornings. Managers who didn't learn his name. Paychecks that disappeared the same day they arrived. He applied everywhere, dressed carefully, rehearsed answers, tried to sound confident even when he felt small. Rejections came fast and casually, like they cost nothing to give. Emails that started with thank you and ended with regret. Phone calls that never came. There were weeks when his bank balance felt like a joke told at his expense. He skipped meals without calling it skipping. He called it saving. He learned how to be quiet about his stress because complaining didn't fix rent. At night, he lay awake listening to the building breathe, wondering how many more years he could live like this without breaking. The doubt didn't arrive all at once. It built slowly, like water seeping through cracks. He started questioning his own judgment. Maybe he wasn't smart enough. Maybe he waited too long. Maybe ambition was something other people could afford. Friends from school posted pictures of weddings, houses, promotions. He smiled at his phone and felt something tighten in his chest. The pressure came from everywhere and nowhere. Family asked gentle questions that still hurt. Coworkers talked about accepting reality, about being grateful. Some nights, he sat alone with his thoughts, replaying every failure like evidence in a case against himself. He tried to motivate himself, but motivation felt fragile. It disappeared the moment things got hard. There was a night when everything almost stopped. He had just lost another job, temporary turned permanent in the worst way. He sat in his dark room, phone in his hand, staring at the ceiling, thinking about how easy it would be to give up on wanting more. To just survive. To stop dreaming because dreaming hurt too much. He wasn't crying. That scared him more than tears ever could. The turning point didn't arrive with clarity or confidence. It arrived on a night when he was too tired to lie to himself anymore. He had come home late, dropped his keys on the table, and sat down without turning on the lights. The room felt smaller in the dark. Everything he owned was within arm's reach, and none of it felt like progress. He replayed the same thoughts he'd been carrying for years. How hard he worked. How little it showed. How close he always seemed to be to something better that never actually came. For the first time, he stopped asking why things weren't changing and asked a quieter, more uncomfortable question. What if this is exactly what my choices are building? That question stayed with him. It didn't accuse him. It didn't comfort him either. It just sat there, heavy and honest. He realized how much energy he spent waiting. Waiting for approval. Waiting for luck. Waiting for someone to notice his effort and reward it. Waiting had started to feel safe because it came with an excuse. If nothing changed, it wasn't fully his fault. That night, he understood something simple and frightening. Waiting was costing him more than failing ever could. The next morning, nothing felt different. The same alarm. The same routine. The same tired reflection in the mirror. But there was a new edge to his thoughts. Less complaining. More attention. He noticed how often he reached for his phone to escape boredom. How often exhaustion became an excuse. How much time slipped through his hands unnoticed. He didn't quit his job. He didn't make a dramatic announcement to anyone. He just made a quiet agreement with himself. If his life was going to stay hard, it was at least going to be hard in a direction he chose. He started small because small was all he could afford. He looked for something practical, something people actually needed, not something that sounded impressive. He searched late at night, reading forums, watching free videos, listening to people who had once been just as lost as he felt now. At first, none of it made sense. The language was unfamiliar. The processes felt overwhelming. He questioned whether he was too late, too slow, too inexperienced. There were moments when he nearly closed the laptop, convinced he was wasting time he didn't have. But he kept coming back. He set rules for himself. No skipping nights unless he was truly exhausted. No pretending to learn by just watching. If he didn't understand something, he stayed with it until he did, even if that meant rewinding the same explanation 10 times. Pride had no place here. Only progress. The laptop struggled to keep up. It froze, overheated, shut down unexpectedly. Sometimes his internet cut out halfway through a lesson. Each interruption tested his patience, but also hardened it. He stopped expecting ideal conditions. He learned to work with what he had. Weeks passed with no visible reward. No money. No recognition. Just effort piling on effort. Some nights, he wondered if he was chasing another illusion. But even in doubt, something felt different. He wasn't numbing himself anymore. He was engaged. Struggling, yes, but forward-facing. He practiced by creating things no one asked for, just to prove he could. He compared his work to others and felt embarrassed, then motivated, then embarrassed again. Improvement came slowly, almost insultingly slowly. But it came. The first opportunity appeared quietly. A small posting, low pay, high expectations. He hesitated longer than he should have, afraid of being exposed as inexperienced. Then he remembered how much fear had already cost him. He applied anyway. When the response came back, his hands shook. Not with excitement, but with disbelief. Someone had said yes. Someone was willing to give him a chance, even if it was a small one. The work itself was harder than he expected. He stayed up late fixing mistakes, second-guessing decisions, checking every detail repeatedly. He delivered it nervous and unsure. When payment arrived, it barely covered groceries. But he stared at the confirmation longer than necessary. Money had changed hands because of something he created. That fact settled into him slowly. This wasn't luck. This wasn't charity. This was value, however small, and it came from his effort. He didn't celebrate. He didn't tell anyone. He reinvested the time instead of the money. He went back to learning with a different mindset. Now he wasn't just studying theory. He was solving real problems. Each project exposed gaps in his knowledge, and instead of feeling discouraged, he used them as direction. More opportunities followed, uneven and unpredictable. Some weeks were busy. Some were silent. Rejection didn't disappear, but it hit differently now. It felt like feedback instead of judgment. He adjusted his approach, refined his skills, learned how to communicate better, learned how to listen. There were moments when he almost sabotaged himself. When things started working, fear shifted shape. What if this was temporary? What if he couldn't maintain it? He caught himself overworking, saying yes to everything, trying to outrun insecurity. That nearly burned him out. So he slowed down, just enough to think clearly. He realized that desperation made him sloppy. Discipline made him steady. He chose steady. The turning point wasn't a single action. It was a series of decisions stacked together. Choosing to learn when it was uncomfortable. Choosing to apply when rejection was likely. Choosing to continue when results were small. Choosing not to quit when quitting would have been easier to explain. Months later, he looked back and barely recognized the person who had sat in the dark, ready to give up. Not because life was suddenly easy, but because his relationship with difficulty had changed. Hardship no longer meant stop. It meant adjust. He still felt fear. He still doubted himself. But now those feelings didn't control his behavior. They followed him instead of leading. The direction of his life had shifted quietly, without ceremony. No one around him noticed right away. But inside, he knew. Something irreversible had begun. Growth didn't arrive like a breakthrough. It crept in quietly, disguised as routine. The days started to blur together, not because nothing was happening, but because everything was. He woke up earlier than he used to, not out of motivation, but out of necessity. There was too much to do, and time had become something he guarded carefully now. At first, the workload felt overwhelming. He was still learning, still insecure, still making mistakes that cost him hours of rework. Some nights he stared at his screen long after midnight, convinced he wasn't cut out for this pace. But the next morning, he showed up again, because momentum, once built, felt fragile. He learned quickly that talent mattered less than consistency. Showing up when he felt tired. Finishing tasks even when the excitement faded. Responding professionally even when feedback stung. Growth wasn't glamorous. It was repetitive. It demanded patience in ways he hadn't expected. Money started coming in more regularly, but not reliably. One month felt promising. The next felt uncertain. He resisted the urge to spend when numbers went up, remembering how fast they used to disappear. Instead, he tracked everything. Income, expenses, time, progress. Seeing it on paper kept him honest and calm. Setbacks didn't stop. A major client left without explanation. A project he invested weeks into fell apart at the last minute. He blamed himself at first, then learned to analyze instead of react. What went wrong? What could be improved? What was out of his control? This shift saved him from spiraling more times than he could count. He invested in better tools before better comforts. The chair hurt his back. The desk was uneven, but the software worked faster. The equipment lasted longer. He postponed gratification so often it became normal. Not because he enjoyed sacrifice, but because progress demanded it. There were moments when friends noticed something had changed. He said no more often. He left early. He declined invitations without explanations. It wasn't isolation. It was focus. Still, loneliness crept in during quiet evenings. He reminded himself that this phase wasn't forever. It was temporary, even if it felt endless in the moment. As his skills sharpened, his confidence followed, cautiously. He charged a little more. Negotiated instead of accepting whatever was offered. Lost some opportunities because of it, gained better ones in return. He learned that saying no could be as powerful as saying yes. Failure became less emotional and more instructional. Each mistake pointed toward a weakness that could be strengthened. He built systems to prevent repeating them. Checklists, routines, boundaries. Structure replaced chaos slowly, like scaffolding around a building still under construction. Burnout came close more than once. He recognized it not as exhaustion, but as resentment. When work started to feel heavy in a way sleep couldn't fix, he paused. Adjusted his pace. Took short breaks without guilt. He learned that rest was not a reward. It was maintenance. Years passed without dramatic milestones. No single moment screamed success. But progress was undeniable. His income stabilized. His savings grew. Emergencies no longer caused panic. He could plan beyond next month, then beyond next year. He made smarter decisions now, not faster ones. He evaluated risks instead of jumping blindly. When opportunities appeared too good to be true, he walked away. When long-term value was unclear, he asked questions. Experience had taught him the cost of impulsive choices. Discipline extended beyond work. He fixed his sleep, ate better, not perfectly, but intentionally. Took care of his body because he realized how closely it affected his mind. Stability in one area strengthened the others. There were setbacks that still hurt. A failed expansion, a partnership that didn't last. Trust misplaced, money lost, but he didn't collapse under them. He absorbed the impact, recalibrated, and moved forward. Recovery time shortened. Resilience grew. At some point, he stopped introducing himself as someone who was trying. He simply was. The work had become part of his identity, not in an obsessive way, but in a grounded one. He knew what he could offer. He knew what he was worth. The growth phase didn't feel victorious while he was in it. It felt demanding, repetitive, and occasionally lonely. But it built something stronger than motivation. It built reliability. And reliability changed everything. Without realizing it, he had crossed a line. From survival to stability. From hoping to planning. From reacting to directing. The success he once imagined as distant now felt inevitable, not because he was special, but because he refused to stop building when progress slowed. He didn't rush the future anymore. He trusted the process he had proven to himself, step by step. And quietly, steadily, his life kept expanding in ways that no longer scared him. The moment didn't announce itself. There was no surge of emotion, no dramatic pause where the world seemed to hold its breath. He was sitting alone at his desk, the same one he'd used for years, coffee cooling beside him as the late afternoon light stretched across the room. He was reviewing numbers out of habit, not expectation. Income streams, savings, investments. Just another check, another routine pass to make sure nothing was off. Then he noticed the total. At first, he assumed it was a mistake. He refreshed the screen once. Then again. He opened another account, cross-checked figures, ran the numbers manually like he didn't trust technology to tell him the truth. His chest felt tight, not with excitement, but with disbelief. The number stayed the same. Solid. Unmoved by his skepticism, he leaned back slowly and let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding for most of his adult life. $1 million. The word felt strange in his head. Heavy. Almost inappropriate, like it belonged to someone else. For years, it had existed as an abstract idea, something people talked about on screens or in stories that didn't resemble real life. Now it was sitting quietly in front of him, understated, almost shy. There was no urge to celebrate. No instinct to call anyone. What he felt instead was calm. A deep, unfamiliar calm that settled into his body like warmth after a long cold stretch. The anxiety that once lived in his chest, the constant edge that kept him alert and afraid, had softened. It wasn't gone completely, but it no longer controlled him. His thoughts drifted backward without effort. He remembered the first place he lived alone. The way the walls echoed because there was barely any furniture. The nights he rationed food without admitting to himself that he was hungry. The embarrassment of declining invitations because he couldn't afford them. The fear that came with every unexpected expense. The way he used to check his bank balance before falling asleep, hoping the numbers would somehow change overnight. He remembered rejection too. The polite emails. The unanswered applications. The jobs that treated him as replaceable. The feeling of standing still while everyone else seemed to move forward effortlessly. He remembered how personal failure used to feel, how deeply it cut, how convincing it was. Those memories didn't hurt the way they once did. They felt distant now, like scars you only notice when you go looking for them. They were still part of him, but they no longer defined his present. He stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the city moved the same way it always had. Cars passed. People walked with purpose. Somewhere, someone was having a bad day. Somewhere else, someone was celebrating something small. The world hadn't shifted because of his achievement. And strangely, that felt right. He realized then that the money wasn't the victory he'd been chasing. It was the evidence. Evidence that the nights he stayed up when no one was watching mattered. That the discipline he practiced when motivation disappeared wasn't wasted. That choosing patience over comfort had compounded into something real. The number wasn't a finish line. It was a marker along a path he had built himself. Later that evening, he went for a walk. The air was cool, familiar. He took the same route he'd walked countless times before, past places that once felt intimidating. Offices he used to imagine working in. Restaurants he once avoided because prices made his stomach tighten. He didn't go inside any of them. He didn't need to prove anything. As he walked, he noticed how his body felt different. Lighter. Not rushed. He wasn't calculating time or money with every step. He wasn't bracing for bad news. For the first time in years, his mind wasn't split between the present and an anxious future. He thought about how quietly it all happened. How no one had clapped when he started. How no one had noticed when he pushed through doubt. How success, when it came, arrived without ceremony. That felt honest. Real. There were still fears, of course. He knew money didn't make life immune to loss or mistakes. He knew markets changed, plans failed, people disappointed. But the fear had changed shape. It was no longer rooted in survival. It was rooted in responsibility. A very different weight to carry. He understood now that security wasn't about never struggling again. It was about knowing he could handle struggle when it came. When he returned home, the room felt different too. Not because it had changed, but because he had. The same desk, the same walls, but they no longer felt temporary. They felt earned. He sat down again, not to work, but to think. He thought about his parents, still working hard, still humble. He thought about the version of himself who once sat in the dark, convinced that wanting more was a mistake. He wished he could tell that person one thing. Not advice, not promises, just that the effort would eventually make sense. But he didn't linger in nostalgia. The past no longer pulled at him the way it used to. He closed his laptop and let the silence settle. There was no urge to stop working, no fantasy of disappearing into luxury. The work had changed him too much for that. It had given him structure, purpose, and a sense of agency he wasn't willing to lose. Wealth didn't end his journey. It simply removed the fear that had once dictated it. As night fell, he prepared for bed, moving through his routine without rush. When he lay down, the ceiling looked the same as it always had. But his thoughts were steady. No mental calculations, no contingency planning, just quiet. Before sleep took him, he felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Peace. Not loud, not perfect, just real. And that was enough.